Okay, class. This is our second lecture for C Just 417 domestic violence. We're just going to do a short video talking about some introductory concepts. Uh, I hope you guys watched the first video. It's very important. I realize it's an intro, but I'll give you a hint. There's a couple tidbits in there that may show up on the quiz, so you want to make sure you watch that too. So domestic violence as a law, it could be defined in a couple different ways. But more or less, what we're looking at is 13700B of the Penal Code. 13700B specifically talks about the definitions of domestic violence, kind of the relationships. So one of the assignments you're going to be getting is defining those relationships. I'm going to say them really quick, okay? Spouse, former spouse, cohabitant, former cohabitant, parent of the same child, dating, former dating, engaged, former engaged. Those are 9 relationships. And in these 9 relationships, the one thing you'll see consistent is intimacy. These relationships must involve intimacy. To make sure we understand that, we have to look at cohabitant, the cohabitant and former cohabitant. In terms of 13700B, which will also deal with our criminal penal codes, we're going to talk about 273.5 and 243E1 of the penal code, which you won't necessarily have to know the codes themselves, but that's felony and misdemeanor domestic violence. That a cohabitant, in terms of those crimes, is going to be someone you live with intimately. So this isn't a college roommate or someone you guys are just living together to share bills. It has to be intimate. So we're talking, and it doesn't matter what the relationship is. If it's a gay, straight, lesbian relationship, anything like that, as long as there's intimacy involved, obviously a couple. Okay. So again, spouse, former spouse, cohabitant, former cohabitant, parent of the same child, dating, former dating, engaged, former engaged. What we're saying is if any of those 9 relationships occur and there is violence, physical violence in the relationship, then that's a crime. Okay. And the difference between felony domestic violence and misdemeanor domestic violence is going to be an injury or the amount of violence used. Real quick, let's talk about abuse. What is abuse? It's going to be in your handout, okay? But basically what we're talking about with domestic violence, it's going to be injury, actual injury or threats of violence. So if I threaten to kill or seriously harm my significant other, then that certainly would fall into abuse, okay? A traumatic condition is something we're going to define for felony domestic violence. Felony domestic violence, 273.5, requires an actual visible injury or a traumatic condition, okay? So a traumatic condition in these terms is going to be an injury I could actually see. A black eye, a cut lip, a missing tooth, a scratch, a red hand mark across the face. But it could also be internal injuries that have been identified by a doctor. Okay, a broken rib. We may not see that, but a medical exam will turn that up. Internal bleeding. Other things that are significant, like strangulation or suffocation. Martial arts, the rear naked choke, those sort of things. Anything like that that cuts off the airway or circulation to your significant other is going to be considered a felony, whether or not injury is there. Okay? So make sure you understand the difference between an injury, traumatic condition, and simple push. And we'll discuss a little bit more about that later. Okay. Another section I wanted you guys to know is 6211 of the Family Code. 6211 of the Family Code gives another definition of domestic violence that includes all the 9 initial relationships in 13700B of the penal code, but then add some more. Now, what we're talking about is cohabitants instead of intimate, like in 13700B, which of course is what we would charge for 273.5 or 243.1 of the penal code, can now include just simple cohabitants, roommates, people who live together. And the reason they have this is so that we could, as police, talk about maybe getting emergency protective orders, which we'll talk about later in the course, or even doing a weapon seizure from the home. Okay, another definition of a family relationship in 6211 is basically anyone who's related by consanguinity or affinity within the second degree. So we're talking about brothers and sisters now, moms and dads. Doesn't have to be intimate now. Again, this is a family code section. Says that if these family members are living in the same household, we won't charge 273.5 or 243.1. There's going to be another just simple battery charge perhaps. But what we can do is we could issue emergency protective orders, and we could seize firearms or deadly weapons from the household. Okay, so make sure you guys go through your Project 1 and Project 2 really good, because it's going to explain all that. Okay, let's see here. Make sure you know your 9 relationships. Okay, again, spouse, former spouse, cohabitant, parent of the same child, dating, former dating, engaged, former engaged. Okay. We've talked about abuse, what abuse is in domestic violence. Again, actual violence, hitting, striking, kicking, biting, things like that. Or a threat of violence. Hey, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to stab you with a knife. Whatever it may be. Those threats themselves can be considered domestic violence. And we talked about a traumatic condition, something you could actually see, or something identified by a medical doctor, or also strangulation or suffocation. Okay? What happens if we get called to a house and it's just an argument? Can couples argue? Okay? Again, no threats of violence. But forgive me for this, but this is a domestic violence class. What if I call my wife or my significant other a fat, ugly pig? Okay, it's a terrible thing to say. It's an ugly thing to say. And I'm not saying that the cops shouldn't go there, try to keep the peace, and even take a police report on that. But it isn't illegal. It's called a domestic dispute. A domestic dispute is nothing more than an argument, but it isn't illegal. It isn't against the law. Okay. Again, is it something we as a police officer should document? Absolutely, because we want to make sure we document the escalation and progress, perhaps, of a very stressful and dangerous relationship, I guess. Okay. So just calling someone a name isn't going to be enough. It's going to be a domestic dispute, and it's really not a crime. Okay. Let's talk about... I want to go back into definitions of domestic violence as they pertain to the 9 relationships. Okay, it's so simple. It used to be really difficult because they defined the injuries differently about maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Now it's very simple. 9 relationships. Okay, spouse, former spouse, cohabitant, former cohabitant, parent of the same child, dating, former dating, engaged, former engaged. If there is an injury, a visible injury, or something identified by a medical doctor, broken rib, internal contusion, internal bleeding, or suffocation or strangulation. I put my hand around my girlfriend's neck and I squeeze really hard. Okay, that is going to be 273.5 felony domestic violence. You guys don't need to know the code, but you need to understand that that would constitute felony domestic violence. If I push my girlfriend, if I grab her by the arm and shake her, if I pull her hair, if I smack her, if I punch her on the back of the head and leave no injury, that's going to be misdemeanor domestic violence, okay? So we need to understand those two things. What we're saying is that violence doesn't have to be visible. It'll just be a lesser crime, okay, a misdemeanor. Now, I'll tell you guys, on my tests and quizzes, I use scenarios, basically. So a scenario could be a boyfriend or girlfriend are sitting in line at a Broadway play. I don't know. That's the best I can come up with. And while they're standing in line, a pretty girl walks by, and the boyfriend looks at her, and his girlfriend smacks him in the back of the head and cusses at him. Hey, you stupid jerk, insert curse words. What do you guys think? Felony, misdemeanor, or no crime? Okay. Did she hit him? Did she strike him? Yes, she did. Was she angry? Did she do it intentfully? Yes, she did. Did she leave a mark? In this case, no. She smacked him in the back of the head. It left no injury. This is going to be a misdemeanor crime. Okay. Now let's change the scenario. Their boyfriend and girlfriend, hence a dating relationship. Same Broadway play, same line, same pretty girl walks by. Girlfriend smacks him on the front of his face and cuts his lip because she has a big old ring on, let's say. Now he has a split lip that's bleeding a little bit. It doesn't have to be a tremendous injury. Now we have a felony. Okay? And the felony is because we have a traumatic condition. We actually have an injury we can see in this case. Okay? So make sure you guys understand the difference between a felony domestic violence and a misdemeanor domestic violence. It's going to be very, very important. Okay? And make sure you understand what a domestic dispute is. All right? The next thing I want to talk about is one of your handouts. You'll see a power and control wheel. Okay? The power and control wheel is very, very interesting. It's something I've used ever since I started teaching this course. Now, keep in mind that the items in this power and control wheel themselves aren't necessarily illegal, but it's going to be a sign or a symptom of domestic violence in the relationship. Think of it as drugs, okay? Someone shoots up heroin. How do we know that they've shot up heroin? They're going to have pinpointed eyes. They're going to have a lower pulse rate. They're going to think slower and act slower because a narcotic analgesic does that to you. If someone takes methamphetamine, their pupils will dilate. Their pulse rate will go up very high. Blood pressure goes up high. They get easily agitated, confused, okay? So what are these things we're looking at? These are objective symptoms of drug intoxication. Well, I would say this power and control wheel, in a way, is objective symptoms of domestic violence. We're not saying that every single time we see one of these things that domestic violence is occurring, but what we're saying is there's a good chance or a good probability, okay? So this is something we want to make sure we identify in our police reports whenever we identify potential of a domestic violence incident, okay? Kind of starting from the top, using intimidation. Very common in a domestic violence relationship. Whether it's a spouse, former cohabitant, parent of the same child, dating, former dating, engaged, former engaged. Using intimidation. Hey, you better get your butt over here or else. You better do this. You better do that. Just that general bullying, I guess, is the best way to put it. We want to make sure we identify that because that's a significant part of this. Okay? Using emotional abuse is the next one. Emotional abuse, you fat, ugly pig. Okay? Why would a significant other say something like that to another person? It's to demean them, demoralize them, make them feel less than. They are emotionally abusing this other person, basically in a way setting the stage for their crime. Okay? Using isolation, of course. If I'm abusing my wife or girlfriend, I don't want them around other people. I don't want them around their friends. I don't want them around their family because those friends and family are most likely going to tell my significant other to leave the relationship, which would certainly be the right thing to do. But I don't, as an abuser, I don't want my significant other, my victim, to be around those people. Okay? I want to isolate them. Okay? Minimizing, denying, and blaming. Okay, very common. This one really gets to me. I don't like this one. I don't like any of them, but this one really bothers me. Come on, I didn't hit you that hard. Quit being a drama queen. Come on, you're tougher than that. You're just acting. You're just showing off. Um, these things are very common in these relationships. I've seen some really horrible domestic violences in my career. And I've listened how the suspect basically rationalizes it. So the minimizing, denying, and blaming is a really important thing to identify in these sort of relationships. Using children, that's a gimme. I mean, certainly they'll say things like, if you leave me or if you do this, and I'll take the kids, you'll never see me again. Using male privilege, that was more common maybe 20 years ago, but we still see it now. A lot of male-dominated cultures. We hear machismo and different, interpretations of that based on a culture. But keep in mind, there are also female matriarchal societies. A lot of the Pacific Islanders, Samoans and such, the mother runs the family. Okay, so we could certainly say that domestic violence could go both ways. It's not always the male that commits the violence, even though that's what we see most often. Okay. Using economic abuse. Okay, this is me telling my significant other victim, no, you can't work. I don't want you working, or you can only work part-time. If I let this person go out and flourish and get a good job, then why do they need me? Okay. Remember, I want to isolate my victim as an abuser. So these are things we want to identify when we're investigating these crimes. And then lastly is coercions and threats, and those certainly kind of go along with the bullying thing. So make sure you guys go through this power and control wheel. Again, these are not things themselves that are crimes, but they're indicia, they're objective symptoms of the crime itself. Okay. Make sure again, we have our quiz coming up, so make sure you guys look at the first video as well as take good notes on this one. Okay. Make sure you understand the difference between felony and misdemeanor domestic violence. Felony domestic violence, the 9 relationships that we discussed with an injury, or something a doctor has identified as an injury, or if I use strangulation or suffocation against my victim. Okay. Remember what a domestic dispute is. It's not illegal, but it's a bad thing. So we still want to identify it, even document it in a police report, keep the peace, but just calling people names, not necessarily enough to identify a crime. Okay. Make sure you guys understand the power and control wheel. Make sure you understand the different ways that a domestic violence abuser may use power and control against his or her victim. Make sure we understand what a traumatic condition is, okay? Basically an injury that could, be visibly seen or identified by a medical doctor. Make sure we know what abuse is as it relates to domestic violence, okay? So we're talking about violence or threats of violence, okay? Make sure you could identify on the quiz the 9 relationships. Make sure you understand a little bit about 6211 of the Family Code, because that's going to become more important later on when we start talking about weapon seizure and emergency protective orders. Okay, basically 6211 of the Family Code again states that we have these 9 relationships, but we're adding a couple more. We're adding cohabitants, non-intimate now, just people who regularly reside in the household, and we're adding any relationship now within consanguinity and or affinity within the 2nd degree. Okay, again, talking about mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, brothers, sisters, those folks. Okay, and really that's it. I hope you guys are keeping up with the reading. The projects I'm going to be giving you are pretty simple. They may take a little bit of time. I want you guys to read through some stuff. Make sure you understand the concepts and that should be it for this one. We'll do another video here, hopefully by next week, and hope you all are keeping up. Okay, thank you.